Thank you very much, and thank you very much for coming today. In order to structure the session for today, maybe I'll speak for 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have ample time for discussion as well. The topic for today's seminar is Failure Café. I understand that the Institute of Advanced Studies had a session called the Festival of Failures in December 2024. So I was not aware that the Institute of Advanced Studies openly talks about failures, but I hope that this seminar will contribute to the scholarship and also to the way with regards to how we treat and talk about failure. So before I introduce myself, I will take you to my opening slide. So this slide is important, and a photo in this slide is super important for me because what you see is the local Tesco here in a rural town of southern Nepal. So here you can see that people are selling vegetables. You can see a truck that is supplying the vegetables. You can see a solar panel that is lighting the neighborhood in the evening. But what you see here is an applied research project. You see the orange blob is the applied research project that perhaps we have developed in a seminar, that we have developed in a research setting. But then the question that I'm trying to ask is, who is looking at this applied research product? How is it engaging with people? Is it leading to any action or inaction? And we'll talk a bit more about that particular research output. And from there, I will talk a bit about failures. But before I do that, I'll talk a bit about myself. Who am I and what I do? So oops. So I'm an international development professional. Currently, I work for the British Embassy as the resilience advisor as part of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. I live in Nepal, and there I lead the Resilience Adaptation and Inclusion in Nepal program. My work primarily concerns working closely with government counterparts and also a lot with international organizations such as NGOs, charities, multilateral banks, and also UN agencies. I'm very much interested in early warning systems, anticipatory action, how research and evidence can shape policy, governance, and the effectiveness of community-based interventions. In terms of my academic background, I'm a civil engineer by training. I have a master's from Durham University, and I have a postgraduate diploma from the London School of Economics and Political Science. So again, drawing you back to the outline of my presentation, we talk about innovation and unknowns. We'll talk about academic and applied research. We'll talk about interdisciplinary collaboration, being explicit about failures and learning, and examples of a practitioner working in the interface of delivery and research from implementation. That's me. I'll share my experience of how does it feel to talk about failures and have applied learning in the process. And then also my experience as an advisor for a bilateral institution. What is the acceptable risk for failures? I think that is also something that is equally important. All right, so the context is, how can we openly talk about failures in academic research, applied research, and research uptake in interdisciplinary settings? And I think that's the whole premise of the talk. What are the incentives and constraints? So organizationally speaking, what will incentivize us to talk about failures, to talk about things that do not work, and be open, honest, and transparent about it. Is it organizational, personal, or professional? I think it's the work culture as well. And also, I think it's to do with where you're working, under which circumstances you're working, and with whom you are working. And what is the cost of failure? I think we don't talk about the cost of failure because I think in research settings, we get funding to do something, but we are always under pressure to publish. We are under pressure to write impact briefs. We are under pressure to produce documents that talks about what has worked really well. And then what is the difference between learning practices and also optimism bias? Because we get really excited when we are working in a particular project, but often we fail to look at our optimism bias. We fail to look at the operational context under which we are working under different working environment and with colleagues as well. So here I will share my experience on use of research uptake when it has been less successful, and what is the process for being persistent on trying again by understanding the limitations, and can we commit to a hard stop for others to take up the challenge as well. And as you will see, I love cartoons, so I've put a cartoon here. And as I work in early warning systems, this cartoon talks about, I'm from the late warning system. If you don't get a warning in advance, this is um, something that happens. All right, so I want to talk about a problem, and I want to talk about something that I've been working for the past 10 years. So, this is an early warning station in West Nepal, and this is the sensor right up here that measures the level of the water. Currently, the water is at 2 meters, but during flooding situation, it rises up till the rock 15 or 14 meters. Imagine this is the inlet from which the water drains from the Himalayas, and then it goes to the plains as well. And this photo is important for me because this is where I started my career in international development 12 years back, and it always grounds me with regards to the problems that we are trying to solve. Okay, so that photo is right here, just to give you some idea of the flooding situation that I'm going to talk about. So, the problem that we had in one of the research questions that we were working on was to increase the early warning lead time. So, if we know that a flood is coming in the next 2 to 3 hours, do people have the time to take preventive actions? 2 to 3 hours is very less, especially in a rural setting, because you have a large family, you may have people with disability, you may have young mothers, you may have children, you may have people who may be doing different things. How can they evacuate to safer locations? Do they have the time? So the problem that we had was, can we increase the lead time? So what we did is we worked with University of Lancaster. We used a black box flood forecasting model, and then we used probabilistic methods to increase the lead time from 2 to 3 hours to 3 to 6 hours. It is probabilistic, but what we tried to do was to give people more time to prepare against an impending hazard, to take preventive action. So this is something that we worked on. And as you can see, we also published a paper on natural hazards and earth system sciences. We also produced a policy brief, but then we didn't really talk about the failures in this case. The failure was, this is only applicable for one river basin in Nepal. There are 20 plus other river basins in Nepal where this can be applied or cannot be applied. So we cannot use this as an example to quantify everything that is happening with regards to flooding in Nepal. So I think when we were writing, we were trying to quantify this as something that can be replicated across the country, but we really hadn't realized that it might take a lot of effort and time to replicate it across the country without really understanding the uncertainties associated with it. And then the flooding was the first question. But the second question that we wanted to ask was, who are at risk? What is at risk? What infrastructure is at risk? Which forests are at risk? So what we realized was there's very limited information on what exists. In 2016, OpenStreetMaps was something that was evolving. We had Google Maps, but we didn't have mapping. So this was the river downstream, and this is something that we mapped after we mapped and things didn't exist in the past. So what we looked at was roads, houses, community forest, irrigation canals, and other things that people deal in their everyday geographies. We mapped it all on the paper, and we put this in an open source platform to understand which assets are at risk or are exposed to risk because of an impending flood. And again, what we did again was we published a policy brief. We wrote a paper, it was peer reviewed and published. But what we again failed to understand was, is this information useful for the people for whom we are conducting the research or for whom we are associated with the research? So I think that was another failure that we failed to take into account, because we were being reflexive, but we were not in a position to really, talk to our data and ensure that people for whom and with whom we are working really understand the data, and can they really make decisions. So that was the other aspect that we failed to appreciate. But then the story of failure doesn't end there, it starts. because as I showed you a diagram that the sensor is located in a very precarious location, and often these sensors they stop working. And these sensors are very expensive, 5,000 to 10,000 pounds. So we were wondering if we could build inexpensive, low-cost sensors to measure water level in a river basin, such that if the main sensor stops working, there is redundancy in the system, and then these sensors can sense data sets. But what happened was these sensors we designed and developed with Imperial College London, and then they were also quite in the experimental phase, and these were acoustic low cost sensors. And then that gave me a realization to first talk about failures. The sensors did not work in its first iteration. We put the sensors there, we didn't know what's going to happen. When we took the data out, the data didn't exist in the first sensor. The data existed quite heterogeneously in the second sensor as well. And we were not able to correlate with the main sensor. So that failed spectacularly. And then that was a point when I wrote a blog post. It is not online, but I still remember the blog post. I wrote a blog post called Learning to Fail. And the first line that I had from that blog post was, often we celebrate success and seldom talk about failure. So that was my starting point after reflecting on the work that we're doing. And in between, we often miss about introspection, self doubt, conflict, managing expectation, being honest and transparent, innovation, untested, conviction, and research. So you are always in that ethical mental dilemma when you are innovating something because you don't know the end result. And I think sometimes you need a leap of faith to go to the next step because you could overanalyze, oversynthesize, and never get to the end line as well. So I think a leap of faith and perhaps having colleagues who trust in your faith and also having managers who trust in your madness is equally important, I would say. And the last line of my blog, and I remember it, is what I wrote was, when we start celebrating failures as equally as success, that is when magic happens. It's a bit philosophical, but I guess it applies in what we do in terms of research and our day-to-day life as well. Again, as I said, low cost sensors we tested, we again wrote a paper just to demonstrate what has worked, what hasn't worked. And academic journals don't like things if they don't work. So we had to play a middle, we had to be in the middle ground writing about what has actually worked. So again, I will take you back to the first slide about the orange blob that you saw in the corner. So that was a heat map. The heat map developed for people in south part of Nepal who are impacted by heat waves. So last week, the Department of Hydromet, or the Met Office equivalent in the UK, issued an alert that the temperatures are going to be between 37 to 38 degrees. So please take action. So I guess that's a heat wave for us in Nepal. For you, I guess it is 20 to 25 degrees, which is happening this week, hopefully. Uh, yes. So these diagrams, they tell us, what are the symptoms of heat wave, what you need to do during a heat wave, and what actions you need to take. And to provide evidence, we also built low-cost sensors. Something that has stayed with me since 2017 is using low-cost technologies to for environmental sensing. And this is something that we used. It's low cost, it's only 100 pounds, and it tells us what the temperature is. We're currently using this in a school because it's easier to engage with students and keep them interested in science, technology, and innovation as well. So, the reason I talk about failures is that I pursue failures for community impact, because ultimately international development is about working for people at risk, working for communities at risk, and ensuring that it benefits in their everyday lives and geographies. So we are always testing, generating evidence and results for service delivery. We know the risks, but we always are in a pressure to demonstrate that things are working. And I think within that demonstration, we forget that things are not working as well. I think managing that and also being able to bring it all together in a learning piece is seldom practiced in international development and also in applied research settings as well, because we always want to talk about things that have worked. And I think that is the tip of the iceberg, not something that we don't see, which is beneath the sea, which is the bottom of the iceberg. And here we talk about citizen science to inform policy. So the low cost sensor that you see we're working in a school, so we have citizen scientists as students, who are working with these low cost sensors. And then we are working towards developing risk communication tools, and importantly, we need to practice what we preach. So here, if I'm talking about failures, I think I need to be equally honest and transparent, talking about failures with my colleagues, with my counterparts, and with my partners as well. And I think what we're trying to demonstrate here is we can be very interdisciplinary. Here you see a mural. It's an arts mural. It's a way of dissecting science, complex information into simple, understandable language. We're using sensors, and then we are also looking at perception as well. Because not everyone may have a degree in geography, computer science, or have PhD, master's, or bachelor's degree. People may not be that fortunate, but I think our role is to ensure that through the research that we take is to make information accessible and make information usable for people at risk such that they can understand and take appropriate action as well. And then the other example, and no more examples after this, just this is the penultimate example, and then I'll talk about the latest example, is about how ideas can lead to more ideation. So in 2018, I wrote a paper and I presented it at the American Geophysical Union. There, I talked about, we have so many maps. We produce a lot of maps, but we don't have a geospatial platform or a web platform to view the maps. And in Nepal, we do a lot of research, but then all research is either in a pen drive, in a CD if it still exists, or it's in our laptops or computers, or it's locked away somewhere. We don't have accessible data sets that people can look at, people can use it for research, or people can use it to make decisions. So that is something that I talked about, and I said it'll be nice to have a geospatial platform. So in 2019, I met with an organization that was willing to work in developing the geospatial platform. But then what I had realized was in the past, a similar effort was tried and tested by another organization, but there was limited uptake by the government and the system failed spectacularly. It didn't work. For 4 years, we invested in the system, but then the system was not used. And then the decision came on me. Should I take the risk of trusting an untested organization because they want to build something that I talked about in an academic research setting a couple of months back? So initially I said no. I said no. I mean, it's not going to work. So what is the point of trying something new? Because it failed in the past. I had the evidence. But then I guess the innovator in me was a bit convinced, or maybe convinced after sleeping over it, when I decided that maybe it makes sense to give them one chance. What will happen? They were asking for £3,000, which was around $5,000 then, and I said, well, we could perhaps lose that money, maybe learn why it didn't work again, and then let's see where it goes from there. But then what happened was in 3 months, the organization was able to build a prototype that was owned by the government. And then we were under pressure to again sustain, what we had preached, because, as I said, we need to practice what we preach. If we are trying for innovation, we need to also be supportive in trying to sustain them as well. So in this example, I used failure as a lens, but then I used inner conviction as something to drive towards an innovative idea that could yield results that I didn't see in the future. But currently, this website that you see hosts a lot of data sets on risk, on flood risk, on earthquake risk, on landslide risk that Nepal faces. And the good thing is that it has data sets that are peer reviewed and are academically available online for anybody to use and see. So again, this is an example where my inner conviction perhaps helped me, but then despite having the evidence of something that has failed in the past, I still went ahead with an idea. But it may not work all the time. It may not work all the time. Maybe it worked this time, and maybe it's an example that I'm sharing with you that, oh, it's a success after 6 years. So that's the other one. And then this is the final example that I'm currently working with professors here at Loughborough University on forecast-based early action or anticipatory action. So what it means is you take preemptive action based on forecasts. As you can see that I'm very interested in early warning systems, very interested in the hazards such as heat waves, flooding, earthquake, and landslides, because I work in the intersection of physical and social sciences. So in a nutshell, forecast-based early action means You have a forecast 3 days in advance, 2 days in advance, one day in advance, and then you use that forecast information to plan for things that may happen in the future. That event may or may not happen in the future. It may be futile. You may lose resources, but at least if you're able to save lives and livelihoods in developing country settings, then this concept works. But I'm critiquing this concept because it is a buzzy word: anticipatory action, forecast based early action. So in LinkedIn posts, I've said that we need to go beyond the buzz. The buzz, and I've added some emojis as well. Buzz is around anticipatory action. Yes, it's a great concept, but challenging to implement, and we need to acknowledge and manage the risks associated with forecast, because the forecast today may not be applicable tomorrow. And and this is very different for different hazards as well. And obviously there are other risks as well that we seldom talk about or are seldom thought about, such as corruption, collusion, risk of sexual abuse as well in developing countries in Asia and Africa, risk of incomplete information, and risk of hiding things that failed and are not reported for wider sharing. And I think that's the biggest risk, because in forecast based early actions, generally things don't work. And generally, we don't share things that don't work. We only share, oh, the forecast came, things happened as it was supposed to happen. We did this and that. This is our learning. But 9 out of 10 times, it's a forecast. It may or may not work. It may or may not impact the communities that people, organizations are working with. So I think this is something that I championed, and I said that we need to think beyond the buzz. And there was a session that I led in the Global Dialogue platform in October 2023 in Berlin at the Global Dialogue Platform for Humanitarian Action. And the session then was called Failure Café: Managing Risks in Anticipatory Action. And there I gave a long monologue on why, what are the risks and why we need to talk about failures. There we had colleagues from the Red Cross, from UN agencies, from international charities, from academic institutions, and also from national governments as well, where we talked about the concept of anticipatory action. As you can see, I like LinkedIn a lot. So these are three posts that I've used from LinkedIn. And this is also a way of communicating, I would say, my thoughts in an open platform, being open about, what I think about a particular thing. Because in LinkedIn as well, we always talk about the good things. We talk about how everything is rosy, but we're not self-critical of the work that we do, and we are not self-critical of the work that others do as well, because we want to appear nice and presentable in a professional platform such as LinkedIn. But there, and again, I've used cartoons as well. And this cartoon is something that an artist drew for me when I explained about my dilemma of mistakes and failures. And this is a dialogue that, I mean, this is a self-explanatory cartoon that the artist drew for me during the Global Dialogue platform in Anticipatory Action in 2023. So yes, I mean, I'll not read through all of my LinkedIn posts. They are quite boring, but they have a lot of emojis if you're interested. I like emojis, as you can see. Is here I am self-critical about the work that I'm doing with colleagues, with my partners. Here I talk about failures. I talk about why we should be sharing failures or failed stories, because then this will give us an opportunity to reflect, an opportunity to discuss, an opportunity to get better. Because if we only talk about success, we will only get, then why are there so many problems that we see if we're only talking about success? So I think that is another thing that I want to highlight through my LinkedIn posts. And again, this is my penultimate slide. I'll not bore you, but I hope the cartoon will draw your interest. Is there are a lot of elephants in the room. We talk a lot about elephants in the room. We don't talk about it. We appear to be very nice in board settings, in corporate settings as well. Nobody wants to really raise the issue, be very polite. But then if we don't acknowledge the risks, if we don't acknowledge things that haven't worked, then we don't get one elephants. We get so many elephants. And these elephants are always there in the background or tiptoeing around the room, telling us that, hey, I exist, but you're not talking about me. And that's why perhaps the phrase is the elephant in the room. So uptake and pathways in advancing research, sustainability, innovation in practice, evidence learning ongoing. I mean, all these are jargon and buzzwords that we usually see in research. But I think the main thing that I want you to take out of this presentation is being honest and transparent, and thinking about the interest and incentives of various stakeholders that we are engaging in any project, and then how we could bring them together to talk about failures, to talk about success, such that we are not penalized for what we are talking about. Because ultimately, be it success, be it failure in any project, I think this will help us understand different pathways or different viewpoints of colleagues, working towards any particular problem. And I think if you want to be innovative, if you want to talk about groundbreaking technologies, I think you need to have conviction. Sometimes you need to trust the naysayers, not always, but sometimes, and see and perhaps hope for the best, that if someone is convinced, let them go ahead with it. But then if they fail, don't draw them down. I mean, just try and understand their viewpoint as well. And this is my final point, final slide. And this perhaps talks about, we should address the human in the room. We always talk about the elephant in the room. We all are humans in the room. And perhaps it'll be really good. I mean, it's not a cafe sort. I mean, we do have lunch, but I think it'll be great if and this will not be recorded, as Kiran tells me. It would be great if I could hear about anything that hasn't worked, and if you're comfortable enough sharing. I've shared openly about things that haven't worked in my career and my professional setting as well, openly and transparently. But I think it'd be great if you could talk about anything that hasn't worked, that perhaps you might want to talk about. And I think it will give us different ideas and perspectives of how success and failures are perhaps part of the same equation, but how we treat it is something that defines us personally and professionally as well. So by saying this, as promised, I've ended the session in 30 minutes, and hopefully we'll have time for discussion, and we can take it from there. Thank you so much.